Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, President and General Counsel of the Church State Council, and I'm here with my co-host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the oldest and very best publication devoted to religious freedom. And together we're trying to take back liberty from the political extremes. And we have a fantastic guest today. So, Bettina, why don't you go ahead and introduce her?
Today, we are delighted to have with us Katherine Stewart, who has spent some 16 years digging into, I guess, what's one of the most powerful but least understood forces in American public life, and that's the intersection between religion, politics, and power. So Katherine is an investigative journalist and author. We talked with her last year about her best-selling book, The Power Worshippers. And she's back with a new book, Money, Lies, and God, which is soon to be released in paperback. So Katherine, welcome back to Just Liberty.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So when we talked to you last about the Power Worshippers, it was talking about Christian nationalism from a certain perspective. Can you help us understand how your most recent book builds on your earlier work?
Well, one big difference is, of course, the arrival of really big money on the scene. There's always been a lot of money invested in the infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement, but other features, other anti-democratic movements have sort of joined with the Christian nationalist movement, particularly a movement called the New Right. And also there's been just this massive infusion of money, even more than before. So that's been a real accelerant. And I would say another accelerant is the breakdown, ongoing breakdown of a certain sector of our media and information ecosystem. Now we have a colossally misinformed public. I think a large portion of the public has been targeted by misinformation operations and propaganda operations because, listen, this is a leadership-driven movement, and the leaders know if you can separate the public from the facts, it makes them easier to control. There's nothing authoritarianism loves more than a disinformed and misinformed public.
Well, your subtitle talks about the movement to destroy American democracy. And, what I'm hearing in the ecosystem, so to speak, is each side, left and right, accusing the other of, wanting to destroy democracy in a way that, it seems almost intentionally designed to make everybody yawn and say, oh, it's not true. Nobody's really out to destroy democracy. Well, so talk about what's really happening and what you're seeing and the implications for democracy. Why, in what ways is democracy really under assault today?
Well, I think we have to look at what's actually happening at the highest levels of our politics. We have all three branches of government currently dominated by the Republican Party, and they have put their faith behind a leader who is enriching himself and his family in unprecedented ways through meme coin schemes and social media things, and accepting Qatari palaces in the sky, trading on the presidency in order to enrich himself and his family. His family has, gained at least $3 billion over the past year, and many estimates say it's much more. So the crypto stuff that they're engaging in, and we really don't have anything like this in our history. Listen, when Nixon attempted to subvert the Department of Justice, and it was released, that information was released through secret tapes, right? His own party, the Republican Party, said, that's right, it's a bridge too far, you have to go. And now we have a president who tweets it all out to Pam Bondi right out in the open, and his party, the Republican Party, yawns. He's basically attempting to deter the Department of Justice, and has, in fact, into his own personal sort of vendetta operation, pursuing his political enemies and promising to arrest them, actually saying on social media that they should be tried and executed for sedition. This is what dictators do. We really don't see anything like this in our history. And listen, in our past, have we had corruption on both sides of the political aisle? Of course we have. But this kind of corruption and self-enrichment, cronyism and kleptocracy makes, say, Warren Harding and his teapot domes look like child's play.
Teapot Dome is actually up kind of northeast of Bakersfield, and I was up there preaching, and there was a whole sign and everything, and got me looking into that scandal. But you're right, they're very, very different in scale, aren't they? Go ahead, Bettina.
Well, I just wanted to focus in a little bit more on this whole organization aspect of Christian nationalism, because, your subtitle talks about it implies a certain level of organization that I think most people don't immediately associate with the idea of Christian nationalism. They see it more as this sort of diffuse ideology that sort of influences individual voters, but it's not really a sort of an organized system, something system. So can you talk us through what you discovered in your investigations?
Sure. Well, I think of it as a mindset as well as a machine. So the mindset draws on the ideology that claims our national identity is bound up with religious identity, and more specifically with certain approved versions of religion. Christianity, as we know, is incredibly diverse in its interpretations, but Christian nationalist leaders in the US cast liberal or progressive or social justice focused versions of Christianity as a form of heresy. This past December, for instance, I attended America Fest. It's a convention of some 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters organized by Turning Point USA. And one of the movement's key players was the leadership-driven movement, organization-driven. Turning Point USA is one of the many key organizations, and their faith outreach director, and this is, of course, before the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk, Lucas Miles was their faith outreach director, and he said it, "I've made it my mission to eradicate wokeism from the American pulpit." And he disparaged, look, so what is wokeism? And he's actually the author of a book titled "Woke Jesus: The False Messiah Destroying American Christianity." So what is woke Jesus? What is this false Messiah? He specifically identified the social gospel as heresy. And another speaker there said there's absolutely no biblical justification for voting Democrat. So it's really hard to overstate the degree to which the politics is leading the religion here, not the other way around. Now, the machine, I spoke about how Christian nationalism is a mindset. It's also a machine. It's a leadership-driven organization machine. The leadership includes organizations that we can group into categories. There are right-wing policy groups. There are legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Council and Pacific Justice Institute. There are policy groups like the American Family Association and the Family Research Council. This is by no means a comprehensive list of organizations. These are just a few examples. There are networking organizations like the Council for National Policy, which gets the leaders of various organizations together with deep-pocketed funders and then gets them on the same page to make sure that, they're all in unity, because, as they say, there's no victory without unity. There's pastoral networks with organizations like Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall. And these networks draw pastors into gatherings, and they, host gatherings, sometimes with dozens or even hundreds of pastors. I've attended a number of them. They give them very voter resource guides, sometimes videos to air at church, sermon starters. And, these are very helpful to these pastors, but they tell these pastors it's their biblical duty to turn out their congregations to vote. And then the materials that they give these pastors leave absolutely no question as to how these congregations are supposed to vote. And they're always in support of the hard right political candidates that are furthering the aims of this broad movement. Now, I want to make a point that, Christian nationalism is not the only feature of the anti-democratic movement. When we look at the funders of the movement, religiously, they're all over the place. So some of them are evangelical, some are Catholic, some are Protestant, some are Jewish, some are frankly atheistic. I mean, look at some of these tech bros that are pouring their money into different features of the broader anti-democratic movement and are allying themselves with it. We can't imagine that most of them are motivated by religious goals. They really don't care. They see religious nationalism as something maybe for the little people to keep them in line. What they want is low taxes for the rich, or no taxes in many instances, economic policies that are going to benefit their monopolistic businesses. They want, in many instances, privileged contracts and taxpayer subsidies. Think of Elon Musk, who has been given billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. And they want sort of justification for oligarchic wealth.
So, I may be getting off track here, but as I'm listening to your specific recitation of policies, I think back to, some of the original founders are the Koch brothers, right? And the Koch, David Koch ran for president on a libertarian ticket. They were friendly with Ayn Rand, famously known as kind of the leading prominent proponent of a libertarian philosophy of low or no government regulation. And here you now have a movement that, wants to manipulate the federal government for their own economic benefit, which is the antithesis of the libertarian ideology. That's where my schooling began, and in my late teens, because of my own family history. But that's a story for another day. It just seems the method of recruiting, using religion to recruit an anti-democratic kind of oligarchic approach to American governance is, it's like I'm shaking my head, right? It's just so bizarre.
It's really funny. I'm speaking of libertarians. I mean, this is just an aside, but take a look at some of the stuff that Cato has actually, which is a libertarian organization, has said about some of the aspects of this movement, which I think is really fascinating. But they've been critical about certain moves. But what you're saying is really interesting, because a lot of the very wealthy funders of the movement, they call themselves pro-capitalist people. They say, let's just let the markets do their things, right? And at the same time, they're pursuing, policies that are going to privilege their monopolistic businesses. They're actually seeking, in some instances, to squelch for other economic players rather than let the markets do their thing. The other thing that libertarians have been, I would say, historically associated with is the idea of personal liberties, which includes, of course, the idea of true religious freedom, the freedom to worship any god or sacred idea, or none if you don't want to. And then, of course, the freedom from being compelled to worship or support any religion you don't want to with your taxpayer money. But religious nationalism is a really effective way of dividing populations. I mean, divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the book. And this is why religious nationalism is such a favored tool of authoritarians around the world. And I think it's easier to see sometimes when it's happening in other countries, right? When you have a leader like Putin in Russia, or leaders in Iran, or Erdogan in Turkey, when these leaders sort of bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries, we rightly recognize that as in order to sort of consolidate authoritarian governance, we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. Now, but these countries aren't true theocracies in that, look, there might be an official religion and they attempt to impose the religious values on the entire society. But what it really is a way of doing is saying there are certain folks in this country who are the insiders, who properly belong, who are affiliated with the correct version of the correct religion, and everyone else who doesn't properly belong, who's really on the outside. And by dividing the population into the pure versus the impure, the insider versus the outsider, people get preoccupied with that sort of culture war stuff, and they're not united, and they're not really looking at the true sources of their challenges, which is, of course, a kleptocratic government, a set of oligarchs who are very close to the leader, one authoritarian leader, who sort of enables them to get enormously rich because they're, his favored people. And of course, this kind of religious nationalism, sort of by saying, I've got the holy men on my side, it makes it harder for any investigation, any democratic investigation of that leader's crimes and abuses that he may be perpetrating against his own people.
I find so fascinating how you have connected the dots between the funders, the influencers, and those at the grassroots, and how the aims of each of these groups are different. In some ways, they're sort of opposed to each other, and yet they're sort of all part of this same system. I'm wondering if you can help us understand how the grassroots is being mobilized. Help us understand how the messaging works, and how are these individuals being pulled into this movement? In many cases, I'm guessing unwittingly.
There's so many different ways. I mean, we all know about Fox News, which is, of course, has a certain bias, but there's a whole ecosystem, information or propaganda ecosystem, far afield of Fox News, far off to the right, that includes YouTubers and podcasters. I have a whole chapter in my book, Money Lies in God, about Reawaken America, which is the traveling roadshow. You walk into those spaces and you hear every single conspiracy in the book. It's the great replacement. They're trying to microchip you. They are controlling every dollar that you make and, every penny that you own, and they're going to change your gender against your will. Really, it's about inculcating in people fear. And JFK is still alive, right? Like, and he's being hidden, and, Trump is a white hat fighting the black. I mean, there's all these crazy conspiracies, but it's these events are designed to sort of confuse people. And in those spaces, you see all these YouTubers and podcasters and pastors. We have a huge number of pastors who have their own separate but adjacent Reawaken activities. And you see that all of this stuff is designed to sort of filter into a whole sector of the population that can be separated from the facts, which again makes them confused and fearful and makes them easy to control. But I want to say something else about the lies and propaganda. There's been a huge propaganda campaign in America against big government or government. Like, who was it? I think it was Grover Norquist, who said, I want to shrink the government so small I could drown it in a bathtub. So when Americans are surveyed about the level of waste and fraud in government, they've always come back with ludicrous estimates, hugely exaggerated estimates. Now, that's not to say that waste and fraud in government agencies don't exist. There's room for improvement always, as there is in the private sector. People need to be reminded of the very good things that government does, along with the very bad things that happen in countries with kleptocratic and cronyistic government, or in countries that have an absence of any kind of effective government at all.
With a complete lack of irony. At the same time that our new administration is railing against, quote, fraud and abuse, they're firing 18 inspectors general who are the professionals to root out fraud and abuse.
Of course. And if you want to look at fraud and abuse, I mean, just look at Elon Musk and his 22-year-old minions rampaging through the government, slashing and burning, uh, firing people who handle nuclear safety codes and food inspection and air traffic. I mean, already we're witnessing a lot of government dysfunction as a consequence of that. And Musk is now the first trillionaire. And I mean, I think he's getting $1 trillion this year. I mean, maybe he's already a trillionaire, but
I think it's stock options that if he succeeds in
okay.
certain goals, that he will become a trillionaire. So the
But
board did approve this plan that could make him a trillionaire, but
right.
he's not there yet.
No, but also Trump and his people are enriching themselves at the taxpayer expense. And meanwhile, you have needless trade wars raising the prices of goods and services for people all across the country. The farmers are really upset because they're no longer selling, certain products to certain countries because other countries have come in and said, oh, you know, um, we'll buy from these other people. And, uh, if anybody who's been to the grocery store lately can't help but see how all of this sort of, waste and fraud and abuse stuff is not really helping them. And meanwhile, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people health insurance premiums are going through the roof. One thing that I find so amusing is that you have RFK Jr. coming in and saying, we're going to make America healthy again. And yet, just a couple of days ago, Trump announced, we're going to suspend rules about water safety. They fired people who, approved new medications. I mean, why on earth would an administration destroy our, scientific research apparatus that has been such a foundation of wealth across the country and made us the envy of the world?
All right, but I want to get back to the basic premise of a movement to destroy American democracy. I mean, I agree. Your perception of the kleptocracy and the Trump and his family enriching themselves right out in public, and there's no outrage.
Mhm.
If people aren't aware of what's going on, it's not because it hasn't been front page on liberal, so conservative, doesn't matter. It's all out there. But Trump arguably has a limited political life, but American democracy is something we want to preserve for the duration, right? So focus on in what ways is there a movement that really has as its aim, because most Christian nationalists aren't focused on destroying American democracy, right? But there
The rank
are.
and file, absolutely not, because the rank and file is, really when they're casting their vote, say, to end abortion or, to infuse their public school with certain interpretation, curricula that interprets the Bible a certain way. They're really just making a statement about what they value in themselves. They're really not arguing for major changes in the way that our government is run, is run. But it's really the leaders of the movement who have a much more anti-democratic agenda. Now, I want to suggest that authoritarianism is better understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support. So when I suggest that the anti-democratic movement is more, is that this movement is seeking to destroy American democracy or is an anti-democratic or authoritarian movement, what I mean is that there are a number of separate pieces and interest groups, sometimes working for different aims, but that they nevertheless end up reinforcing one another. So they're rowing in the same boat in a sense, but it's the outcome of their actions working together that can be unpredictable and can lead to consequences that many of the rank and file, frankly, who are lending their support to the movement with their vote, neither anticipate nor want. If we look at a movement called the New Right, I have 3 or 4 chapters in my book, Money Lies in God, about the New Right. They're less explicitly Christian nationalist, but more explicitly anti-democratic. Many of them say that democracy won't deliver to them the policies that they want. They long for what they call a red Caesar, meaning, a dictatorial leader who is red. And they rail against what they call the elites, but really what they want to be a new elite, and that is very clear.
So is that related to the sort of post-liberalist movements that we see coming out of like Catholic integralism and common good constitutionalism? Is that sort of part of the same bundle, or are you talking about something completely different? I mean, I know you said the new right is less explicitly religion, and many forms of post-liberalism is very explicitly religious, but are they kind of all working toward the same thing?
Well, there are these different strands. I mean, movements like the
Right.
they're very complex. You have people like Russell Vogt, who
Yep.
is the director of, of the
OMB.
Office of Budget, and he is, self-identifies as a Christian nationalist, and yet he's also a sort of card-carrying member of the New Right. And then you have other New Right members who are less explicitly religious nationalists or don't even seem to have religion really on their radar. But they sort of collaborate in think tanks like the Claremont Institute. They gather together and talk at places like the National Conservatism Convention.
Hmm.
And I have, material about both of those organizations and their different sort of historical strands in Money, Lies, and God.
One of the things that strikes me, Catherine, I've been at this a long time. We did an interview with someone recently who also, goes back to the 1980s and where they started out. And, back during the Reagan years, you had, leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson who might get an invite to the White House, but they didn't have the trained, legions of young professionals who could take up positions in government and do the business of reshaping the government. But, your mention of Russell Vogt, it's clear to me now in my interactions with government that in the Justice Department, in the EEOC, in all of the different agencies, you now have a generation later where, yes, there is a legion of professionals who've been trained into this Christian nationalist movement who are being invited to take over the levers of power. And, it's not just an ideology anymore. It's very much in a position of substantial power and control within the American government.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing the movement is really good at is leadership training. Uh,
Hmm.
there's plenty of money on, when I say the left, I mean, the moderate, center, moderate, liberal left, that's sort of large, I'll call it the left, but they're not all leftists. So there's plenty of money on the other side of the political aisle. Let's just call it, the pro-democracy side of the political aisle. But it's spent differently. On the right, money is spent on people and organizations. They find individuals who have some talent. They really develop them, invest in them so that these individuals know that they can shore up their economic future within the movement. And on the sort of moderate liberal left, you don't really have quite as much going in that way. A lot of money goes to individual politicians, might go to somebody, let's say some, politician in Georgia, who, by the way, whose war chest might be big enough. And then, of course, if that politician loses their race, where does the money go? But if you invest in organizational infrastructure that's existing outside of these politicians, then it's like the organizations are actually the ones in control rather than the politicians. I mean, this is one of the things that, I was recently in Texas and I was talking a bit about Tim Dunn. He's one of the big funders of the movement. He's an oil billionaire. And he's invested a huge amount of money in these organizations that target insufficiently conservative, I want to say insufficiently radical Republicans. And they say, if you don't endorse these positions that we like, we're going to fund a primary challenger. So you need to be on board with our positions. So that's one of the things that they do that I think is very effective. You know, the left tends to invest again not in politicians, but also in sort of technocratic solutions. Like if we fix this problem or that problem, then people won't have these types of resentments and they'll vote differently. Well, people aren't always that rational in the way that they vote. And the one thing the right is really good at is playing identity politics. Frankly, I think that a lot of folks think of identity politics as something that happens on the left, and there's certainly some of that. But I think the right plays identity politics harder. They know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, then you can control their vote. So for a long time, they devoted all of these resources into turning their people into, they call them pro-life voters, or defenders of the American family. And it's the irony, of course, is that, this is a movement that claims to stand for the American family, but it's driving support for politicians whose policies are actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed.
Just listening to you talk about this, Katherine, I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit about your process. I mean, how do you go about investigating something that is just such an octopus? There's so many different avenues that you can go down, and I'm guessing a lot of it is sort of on the ground, actually going to events and meeting people. How do you go about this process?
Well, thanks. I read a lot. I spend a lot of time reading the books that movement leaders write themselves, and listening to them on their podcasts and radio shows and things like that. And I go to events because I've always thought that you really can't know what's happening unless you're in the room where it's happening and where it's being discussed. And I what I do is not in any way undercover. I use my real name. I don't wear disguises. Um, I'll dress for the occasion. So if an event calls for cowboy formal, I'll pull out my cowboy boots. You know, but I just try and go and keep my ears open. This is a movement that's people are so shocked by stuff that they see, but they're not hiding. They tell us what they're going to do, and then they do it, and then they tell us that they did it. And I think the problem is that a lot of folks in sort of mainstream media hear stuff that they say, maybe they'll catch it somewhere, and then they'll say, well, they didn't really mean that. They'll try and sort of reframe it in ways that try and make themselves feel more comfortable. But they're not hiding. It's just that a lot of people haven't been listening.
Well, Katherine, I think before we close, I know there are many who are feeling frustrated, who are feeling powerless, right? It's like, every day or every week we open up the media and we see another shocking thing happening, another assault on the rule of law, on our democratic governance. We're like, we feel powerless. What do we do? Right? What would you say to those who are feeling that way and they want to be able to do something to make a difference?
Well, this is not the time to get into bed and suck your thumb. This is a time for walk. I mean, really, who said that? I heard Steve Bannon say that at America Fest. He said, when you lost in 2020, you didn't get into bed and suck your thumb. You got out there and you decided to fight. And, they did things we would never want to do. Like we would never want to, those of us who believe in democracy and its promises would never want to inspire political violence. We would never want to spread disinformation lies. But one thing that they did do very well is they turned out their base of voters and they went after low propensity voters. They went after people who don't vote very often or who had never voted before. And it's really important to know that without the vote, this is the only way to shift the system. I remember Ralph Reed, who's another movement leader, said at one point at a gathering I attended, he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right. And people also need to know that, when it comes to the vote, you might not have a perfect candidate, but you really need to think of it as playing a game of chess. Or, okay, easier. Think of it as being on an airplane. You're really hungry. The food's going to be terrible. So the flight attendant comes by and says, would you like the chicken? Or would you like this pile of garbage with broken glass mixed in? You're going to have the chicken, right? So, there are a lot of reasons why there was a sort of depressed enthusiasm for voting in the last election. But elections are always one of the margins. And if you look at the number of voters, it was still at the margins. And if more folks had, turned out to vote, decided, well, this might not be my favorite candidate, but this election is about judges. It's about people who are going to handle food safety. It's about people who are going to, strengthen our international alliances rather than blow them up. It's about people who are going to invest in alternative energy instead of destroying those contracts, which brought so many jobs to red states. It's about, continuing along with the scientific research apparatus rather than destroying it. It's, I think you have to weigh, this goes back to the chess thing. You really have to weigh your options and know that your vote really matters. And there are so many pro-democracy organizations out there. It's really important to engage, whether it's a kind of sort of a faith community that is, consonant with democratic values, whether it's an organization that defends the vote, whether it's an organization that sort of engages in pro-democracy activity in different ways. There's so many avenues for engagement. So there's no one size fits all answer. Everybody's got to do a little research and figure out where their talents and, can be utilized. But I think it's really important to note that we are not powerless. I think a lot of people right now are really seeing through the lies that they have been fed.
Well, Katherine, thank you so much again for talking with us today about your new book, Money, Lies, and God. And we will be waiting to see what comes next from you. And I'm sure there will be more in the future, and we'll look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much. It's always great to talk with you.
Well, Bettina, I think the first thing I want to say here in thinking about this interview is to remind our listeners that we here are not partisan, right?
Yes, correct.
Because, Katherine Stewart was advocating voting, and it's pretty clear, I think, which way she would encourage people to vote. And that's all well and good. That's her opinion. We have to be very careful because we are 501c3 and we don't advocate, for one party or another partisan. We're looking at principles, at what's happening in our society with our democracy, with religion and church and state. But, to her substantive points, I thought her observation that the right does an awful lot better at leadership training than the left was very, very insightful, very interesting. And I think we're seeing that today, in the thing that Americans don't really perceive is the extent to which Christian nationalist trained leaders are now exercising the levers of power throughout our government agencies at federal, state, and local government levels.
Right. And she has those insights because she has studied this movement for so many years. And she sees those connections, which most of us simply do not see. And she sees how it works together and she sees the outcomes. And I think, this is the problem in talking about this issue because it seems so inherently political because we're talking about it within the context of now and within the dynamics, the political dynamics that we're seeing in America today. We can't talk about it in a vacuum. And that was my discomfort, I guess, with many parts of that interview, because it did come across as inherently political, partisan. But that's not what we're about, Alan. What we're, as you say, what we're trying to look at are the underlying connections between faith and politics in a way that distorts both. It distorts both religious expression, and it distorts the expression of our political democracy as well.
Well, and, thinking about one of the things that she led off with in talking about, the movement to destroy American democracy was about the Trump family corruption. And
Right.
I'm like, okay, yeah, it's out in the open. It's not really disputed. He's very upfront about it. It's been widely reported in the news. It's not a scandal as such. At least nobody's made it into a scandal. But it's like, well, what does that have to do with eroding American democracy? And that wasn't entirely clear, why she was looking at that. Except I think it's a symptom rather than a cause. That our what do you call it? Our boundaries are eroding, because compared to the corruption of the Nixon administration, this is of a completely different order, and yet there is no pushback against it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I've read her book, and it does, I think you need to read it through the lens of, this is coming from a certain political perspective, but that doesn't negate the, the value of what she is uncovering. And, I think it's a book well worth reading. I think it helps shine a spotlight on a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing today. But I think it's our job, Alan, to take that information and to bring it into more of a faith space. And what does this mean for us as people who are followers of Christ, people who value American democracy, of course, but that's not the be-all and end-all of our existence. That's not the sort of the North Star of our existence. That's another thing entirely. We need to be careful in talking about these issues.
Well, and we need to be, I think, more skeptical even at buying what either side is selling to us, right? I have a book series that I have imagined for years. I've never written it yet. I wish I could just tell AI to write it for me or something, right?
No, don't do that.
But the book series is under the auspices, under the title of A Skeptic's Guide, like A Skeptic's Guide to the End of the World, or other sort of religious topics, because my premise is not that we're too skeptical, but we're not skeptical enough. Okay. And, take what she was saying about the money that's behind
Yes.
Christian nationalism, right? How ironic that those who have been the loudest advocates of libertarianism are now the largest benefactors of favorable government policies. And that's exactly what Ayn Rand was writing about, was writing against. And I've said this so many times because it's just so bizarre to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Alan, it goes to the point that to be human is to be a hypocrite. I mean, this is just what humans are,
Really?
That's
our destiny, is it? That's so positive, Bettina.
I'm sorry. No, that's a very negative direction to go. Well, I tell you what it does make me think of, and that is one of my favorite quotes from Ellen White about politics. And she says that there is decided danger when anyone links themselves to the political parties of this world because, she says, there is fraud on both sides. And I think that if you take that on board and you look through that lens at the political dynamics that we see around us today, I think that will serve you well.
And I'd like as our takeaway for our listeners, regardless of what your politics are, to see this discussion as our commitment to American democracy, wherever the attacks come from, right? So on that note, this has been Just Liberty. I'm one of your hosts, Alan Reinach, with Bettina Krause. Until next time, remember that eternal vigilance is still the price of liberty.